What if I told you that one of the most puzzling unsolved cases in Oklahoma didn't begin with a burning car? It began with a wife, a mother, a church bulletin, and a home that looked like someone had simply stepped away for a few minutes. For nearly 40 years, yes, 40 years, people have debated what happened to Aeileen Conway. Was it a tragic accident? A medical emergency? Did she interrupt a crime? Or was someone else in that car? Tonight we're going to do something a little differently. Before we examine the mystery, I'd like you to meet Aeileen. Welcome to Grace and Gavel, where truth meets compassion. I'm Buffy. As an attorney, I've spent years looking at evidence, not to prove what I want to be true, but to understand what the evidence can actually tell us. On this channel, we don't sensationalize tragedy. We remember that every cold case began with someone who was deeply loved. Today, that someone is Aeileen Conway. Meet Aeileen. Before she became part of an unsolved mystery, Aeileen Conway had already lived an extraordinary life. She married as a teenager. By the time she was 50 years old, she and her husband, Pat, had been married for 33 years. Together, they raised 4 daughters and 3 sons, 7 children. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't simply a woman living alone. This was the center of a busy family. Pat was a businessman. Their children's school was only about a mile from home. Life revolved around routines: school, church, family, responsibilities. When I first began researching this case, I became frustrated. Every article wanted to tell me about the crime scene. Very few wanted to tell me about Aeileen. And that's backwards, because ultimately the heart of true crime are those who were taken, whose lives were taken, and whose family had to pick up the pieces. Because as a victims' rights advocate, both for sexual assault victims as well as domestic violence victims, the survivors are the heart of the story, not the surrounding details. They are the importance of the story, to remember them, to give them dignity, and to show compassion to them and their families. Because before she became evidence, she was a person. And if you look, you will see a photo of the family. You can look up Aeileen Conway, and it will show you a photo of her entire family. A beautiful photo. And everything changed in one ordinary morning. The morning that never ended. When investigators entered the Conway home, it wasn't ransacked. Instead, it looked interrupted. A bathtub had been drawn. An iron had been left on. A garden hose continued filling the swimming pool. The telephone had been taken off the hook. At first glance, some investigators wondered whether the scene had been staged. But I'd like you to think about something. Have you ever tried to manage a household? Laundry, dinner, children, appointments, phone calls. Sometimes life isn't orderly. Sometimes it simply looks interrupted. That distinction matters, because the interpretation of these details shapes every theory that follows. The bridge. Later that day, everything became far more tragic. Aeileen's vehicle crashed. A fire followed. Not just any fire, an extraordinarily intense fire. Reports describe damage so severe that the vehicle became fused with the bridge's metal guardrail. The guardrail itself sustained extensive heat damage. Immediately, questions began. Was this simply the result of a catastrophic crash, or was something more happening here? Why investigators began asking difficult questions. One investigator in particular, Ray Anderson, believed the fire deserved closer examination. According to accounts of the investigation, he requested that the fire marshal evaluate the scene because of concerns about the fire's intensity. That's an important distinction. He wasn't concluding what happened. He was asking whether the physical evidence matched an ordinary vehicle fire. That's exactly what good investigators do. They ask questions. And if a question doesn't make sense, they follow up. They talk to experts. They do their research. Not because they already know the answer, but because something doesn't fit. The clues. One detail involved a church bulletin, which had initially been on her dashboard. And Aeileen was known to have her air conditioning on. However, she would never open her windows. So the question is, how did the church bulletin that had been on her dashboard all of a sudden end up on the side of the road in an area where Aeileen had never been to, according to her husband? He had never been there either. So there is speculation or potential conjecture that someone was in the vehicle with her. Family members reportedly described Aeileen as someone who normally drove with her windows up. Yet a church bulletin associated with her was reportedly found outside the vehicle. Does that prove someone else was in her car? No, but it is one of several observations that investigators considered. There were also reports of burglaries occurring in the area around that time. Could Aeileen have interrupted a crime? Again, we don't know. It became one of several investigative theories. Notice something. No single clue solves this case. Instead, investigators were looking at the totality of the evidence, which is extremely important. That is an important lesson for every investigation. You can't just be married to one particular theory and assume that it's going to solve the case. Let's talk about the human story. One fact stays with me. Pat Conway remarried several years later. Some people mistakenly interpret that as moving on. I see something different. He still had 7 children to raise. Life doesn't stop after tragedy. Birthdays continue, school continues, children continue growing. Yet by all public accounts, Pat continued seeking answers about Aeileen until his own death in 2013. That tells me something. He never stopped asking, what happened to my wife? What we know Aeileen was loved. We know she was 50 years old. We know she had been married for 33 years. We know she was the mother of 4 daughters and 3 sons. We know her death changed the lives of an entire family, a large family also. We also know many questions remain unanswered. So in closing, cases like this remind us why humility matters. Sometimes evidence answers our questions. Sometimes it simply teaches us better questions to ask. Perhaps that's why the Aeileen Conway case continues to resonate nearly 4 decades later. Not because it offers easy answers, but because it reminds us that behind every cold case is a family still wondering. Before we close, I'd like you to remember Aeileen, not as the woman in the burning car, but as the wife, the mother, the daughter, the sister, whose story deserves to be remembered. If you've learned something today, or if you have respectful thoughts about the evidence, I'd love to hear them in the comments. Please keep the discussion focused on the documented facts, and remember that real families live within these stories. I'm Buffy. This is Grace and Gavel, where truth meets compassion. And until next time, take care of one another. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. If you got value from this, please feel free to like and subscribe. I'd greatly appreciate it. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.